Hey all y'all, I am just going to walk you through a couple of quick tools in Rhino and then we're going to get straight into Illustrator. So, looking at the parallel view, you know how to make 2D, which I'm running right now, but for a couple of these drawings you're going to want to have the show hidden lines on. And when you do, press OK, go into top view, you'll notice that it has these extra lines. Mine are white, so they're pretty hard to see, but those are your hidden lines, and you will need them and keep them on a separate layer, so you might want to select this and export it. I already have mine sitting over here, so I don't need an extra one, but what I'm going to do is show you how to create a very fast silhouette. Probably too late, most of you have probably traced it already, and tracing it doesn't take that long, but you can actually do this even quicker in Rhino using two tools. One tool you already know. It's the rectangle tool. I just typed rectangle and I'm just going to drag it and surround my object. It doesn't matter which object. This one has hidden lines, this one does not. I'll show it with hidden lines just to illustrate first. Now what I'm going to do is select all of my objects or any boundary objects that I'm interested in and then type in curve, C-U-R-V-E, Boolean. Now, wherever I select, it will essentially automatically fill in like your live paint tool and then associate curves with what you've selected. So if I select here, you've noticed that it's boldened the border and the outside of my shape because that's where all of these things changed. I could continue and select some of these inside boundaries, and you'll notice the border just changes or it creates a cavity in here. They start to connect with each other. When I press enter, it makes a curve. All right, so you can make some pretty interesting shapes with this that are convolutions of your project. In fact, I like this. I might export this. This blocks 4. And use this later on down the road, but for our purposes we want to make this silhouette. So I'm going to repeat this process, curve Boolean, select the outside, enter, and now I have my silhouette and also an outside box selected. So I'm just going to drag this off. It copies. I'm going to delete this rectangle and voila, we have a silhouette which you can move into Illustrator and place over your images as a separate thing, making your silhouette. So let's go into Illustrator. I've already exported all of these shapes. We're just going to look at the isometrics today, but I've already exported these shapes for convenience. I'm going to show you guys what I've been building. We're going to build the textured block together in this video, but I've already built the additional block. So you know how to live paint and you know how to use your gradients, but why don't we walk through this step by step? Actually, before we get there, we'll go from left to right and we'll touch on appropriate line weights first. So for the time being, I'm going to turn the paint layer off. I'm going to go down to this unfiltered version of the above image, and you'll notice that I already have my silhouette in here, but when you import this silhouette, if you went through the process that I just showed you, this thing will be hovering alongside, and you can essentially line this up with it. In this case, I have my line set to a specific setting that I'll show you in a minute, and then the silhouette works on the outside. Let's start with reviewing let's start with reviewing how to lay things out on the page, which is good because it looks like mine is not laid out on the page correctly. So let's say you import all of your objects, or you open this file, and then you create an artboard, and you want to check up here, make sure your width is at 17 and your height is at 11. That's good and that's good, so I'm just going to select out of here. And now I want to create these guidelines, which have to be on their own layer in my version of Illustrator, but in your version of Illustrator, they might be independent as they go. So I have my layer up here called Guides. You may or may not see these rulers. If you do not see the rulers, you can go to View, Rulers. It'll say Show Rulers instead of Hide Rulers here. And then you can go up to the ruler and drag down, and it creates a guide. What's nice about this is that you can select the guide, and up here in your settings, if you're running Essentials Classic, you will see that you have an X and a Y value, as well as a width and a height. It seems like an arbitrary way to, or not an arbitrary, it seems like an old way to line these things up is to use these coordinate values, but I actually end up using these quite a lot. So your Y0 value, your 0, 0 is up here on the top left, as indicated by the ruler, 0 and 0. Your X is in the X direction, your Y is in the Y direction. It gets a little confusing because Y is sort of moving in the negative, but you get used to it after a bit. We know we want to have margins that are 1.5 inches past every page, so what you can do is you can drag this guide and get it to about 1.5 inches. But if you'll look up here, you'll notice at the Y position, it's not at 1.5 inches. So what I'm going to do is type in 1.5, and I know for sure that this is at 1.5 inches, at least in the Y direction. And the same thing for the X direction. I selected that. I already have it at 1.5 inches. So set up your guides to have 1.5 inches border on either side. And I'm going to lock the guides layer, and I'm going to place these individually. What I'm going to do is, could group this, but I think it would flatten all the layers. So I'm going to do this the analog way. I'm going to drag it and drop it at the border. So I know this is hugging the left, or the right, rather. I'm going to do the same with my left shape. I'm going to drag it, drop it at the border. Another really useful tool that I have working right now for me is the Smart Guides, or it may not be called Smart Guides. Yeah, it is Smart Guides. So you can turn this on here. It's also under your preferences. In some cases, this has to be on even if Smart Guides is on in your preferences, and I think if this is on and it's off in your preferences, it also won't work. So you can access that via Preferences, Smart Guides, Alignment Guides, Anchor Path Labels. These are all, these two in particular are really helpful. And what it does is when you have a tool selected, it will give you a vertical and horizontal to any anchor points that you're hovering around, or horizontal or vertical to. So if you, say, wanted to select this anchor, it gives you a little bit more leeway to get there, or you can go straight horizontal from it. I like this tool sometimes. If you have really complex geometry, it starts to get in the way, but for our purposes, it's really useful. It's really useful in terms of dragging and dropping these things. It will help you snap this. You'll notice it gets a little snap, and you see a green line. And that's because I have my alignment guides on. So now I know this edge is perfectly on this guide. Okay, last shape. Now, spacing between these two, I don't have a perfect way to do this other than if you have an uneven number, your center shape, you know it's going to be in the center of the page. And we know our page is 17 inches wide, and half of 17 is 8.5, so I'm just going to run it at 8.5. And I believe your alignment guides will even get you here. Let's see. If I hover over, it intersects vertically with, if you saw the vertical green line, it was intersecting with a midpoint, and I believe it was the midpoint of the page. Let's try that again. See, it stopped me here, so I'm at the midpoint of this line, which is in the center of the page, and you'll see I'm already at 8.5. But if not, you can select your object and take its center to 8.5. Additionally, if you wanted to do this with these objects, you can run up here to this little square, and you'll notice there's a black square in the center. That means that it's taking the coordinates from wherever the center of this object is. But if I click it on the right, now it's taking the coordinates from the right side of that. And so what I can do, and see it's not already perfect, is take 1.5 minus 17, which in this case is 15.5. And now I know by coordinates that I'm touching this guide. Okay, into line weights. Sent you guys this PDF. Use it. It's pretty helpful. You have your silhouette at 5 point, your cliff at 2 point, which just means any edge that isn't running along another surface to surface connection that's visible. Instead, this runs to a surface or cuts to a surface that is invisible or behind the object, so it gets an extra point. Outside edge, in this case, an edge that is sort of facing you is 1 point. An inside edge, an edge that is facing away from you, is 0.5 point. A coplanar seam is 0.25 point. And I sent this in the email, but your hidden lines are going to be a 0.25 point as well with a 2 point dash. So let's start with that. I'm going to select my hidden lines using this selection tool over here. I could also lock my layers and then manually select, but this is much quicker. Over here, this little circle, whatever the heck that thing is. I'm going to put this at 0.25 in my stroke weight, and then set it. Let's assume that it wasn't dashed before. Turn the dash on and make sure the dash is at 2 point dash and 2 point gap. And here we are, perfect hidden lines. Okay, I'm going to lock that, and let's get into some of our conventions. So, again, 5 point silhouette, 2 point cliff, outside edge. Let's start with the silhouette. So I have a silhouette layer where I've put my silhouette on. I'm just going to select it really quick and bring it back to factory settings. Okay, 1 point. I'm going to set it to 5 point. And as some of you have probably noticed, it gets a little messy here where it comes in and cuts into your object. There's a way to fix this if it is a closed curve. Over in your stroke options, you have options such as a round cap for empty cap. Also corner options. I have the miter join on. You could round it or you could bevel it. You see the difference there? The bevel, rounded, mitered. I'm using mitered. There's this last option here called align stroke. And what this does is it moves the thickness of this stroke to the center, inside, or outside of your vectors. Right now it's on the center. If I move it to the inside, it moves in, which we don't want. I'm going to move it to the outside. Look at that. Fix that problem. Nice and easy. Now we've got a really nice outline or silhouette, and I'm just going to, I believe these both are silhouettes, so I'm going to press my eyedropper tool and copy those preferences. The hotkey for an eyedropper tool is I. You can also find it over here, and it will copy the appearance of any object. If the first object you have selected will change, and the second object you select is what it will change to. This is really useful for quickly changing appearances if you want. Okay, I'm going to lock my silhouette, and now I'm going to unlock my wooden plaster layers, and let's start with the cliff, 2 point. I have everything else set to 1 point currently, so I'm just going to select some cliffs. I'm not going to do this whole thing, but you'll kind of get the point. Running through, this is an overhang, overhang, overhanging, also overhanging. Another really useful tool, you'll notice that in many cases your lines like these will be joined and there'll be a single line, but we have 3 different line weights associated with this line. We have a curve facing us, or an outside curve. We have a coplanar line, and then we have a cliff edge. So a tool that I like to use to break this up is the scissors tool, which is this little scissors icon guy over here. You could also press your hot button C, and I'll hover over these points, and what it does is it clips the line. So now I have 3 separate lines. I'm gonna make that guy 0.25 because he's coplanar. I'm gonna make this guy 1 because it's an outward facing. Okay, so run through and fix all your line weights, make sure they're right. These cliff edges are, I think, the most important ones to get right. They're kind of difficult to catch every single one. You have to remember what your geometry is doing, and all that stuff too. I actually think that's pretty close. Might as well finish it at this point. Okay, let's assume that's close enough. The next highest is the outside edge, which is set to 1 point, which we don't have to do because all of our lines are set to 1 point. So I'm just going to run to the inside edge, which is a half point. Here's an inside edge, so on and so forth. Okay, let's assume we got all of those. .5. Now the top of this is looking pretty nice. In the end, it should look very much like this, where your projections are really showing clear, and the parts where they're connecting to other objects are a little lighter, and your outline is really helping it stand out. I've even taken the liberty of doing a couple of these hidden line moments to be a little darker if I wanted to accentuate a really strong shape. You can do that if you want. I wouldn't go above really a 0.25 for these. You might just want to drop the rest of them down to 0.1, which it looks like these are all at 0.25 and most of these are at 0.1. I would experiment with that and see what you like. There really is no correct answer with these. Okay, life paint. Let's start over. A lot of you have been doing life paint wrong, so to speak, where you've been just painting over your parent object. What you need to do is select your object, copy it, and then paste it on a new layer that's underneath that object. I've named this layer Life Paint. I'm going to paste in place, which is Control-Shift-V or Command-Shift-V if you're on a Mac. I'm going to lock my layers above, and now I have an isolated Live Paint layer, which I'm going to make the Live Paint by pressing my hotkey K. It's my Live Paint tool. When I click, it creates the Live Paint system. So I'm going to show you guys how to make a gradient really quick. I know you know how to make a gradient, but I'm going to show you how to optimize your gradient in a way. So I have here selected a gradient I've made with pink and purple, and I'm just going to run this along. This will look familiar to some of you, where the gradient is applied at the same intensity and the same direction on every surface. This can be a nice effect. Personally, I like to weight it in a nice way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run over to my gradient tool, which is also the hotkey G. Here's the gradient tool over here. And what you have when you have the gradient tool selected is the ability to drag the direction and scale of your gradient. So I'm going to drag this and let go, and what it does is it unifies the gradient from my starting point to my finish point. I'll illustrate this in another way. If I dragged it this way, you're going to get a different pattern. If I started way up here, the pink is going to somewhat disappear and it's going to be much more purple because the starting point where the pink is at its most pink is off the object. I want it to look something like this, and so I'm pretty happy with that. Now I'm going to select another gradient. Whoa, hey, didn't mean for that to happen. I think that's because I had my live paint object selected. Now I'm going to select another gradient, turn on my live paint tool, and select these faces. You'll notice again, as I make this gradient, that it's applying to each face independently and not following the gradient that we just made, or at least the gradient scale that we just made. In order to change this, we again have to select our object, go into gradient, and reestablish a direction and scale. So here's an object. Nice and easy. You may even want to gonna make these lines white, just for fun. Nope. And they look pretty light in this case. Maybe we want to buff these up a little bit. I'm just going to quickly do a stroke of 2 and see how that looks. I think that looks pretty nice, especially with the silhouette turned off. Or with the silhouette on. I don't know, play with it. Okay, next is a particularly more difficult procedure where we're going to mask in a texture. So there's a number of ways you can do this. I prefer to use the mask. You could also bring this in and create a hatch of sorts if you wanted to create a hatch. I found this wood texture online. It's nothing special. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to delete my mask layer and redraw these. I'm going to create, well, first of all, your texture should be on its own layer. I'm going to call this a parent layer because it needs to stay on this layer, and you're going to copy it from this layer every time you mask it. So make sure that this image never alters. You're going to alter a copy of this image every time. So I'm just going to copy that with Control-Z. And in a new layer, I'm going to call this mask layer. I'm going to draw around where I want this object to be. And in this case, I need to draw in a color so that you'll see. That's just bad placement. I have my other layers on, that's why it's doing that. Okay. So in this case, I want this wood texture to be on this block. And I want it to cut out from its shape, so I'm just going to trace this shape. This is where the curve Boolean tool can really come in handy. If you wanted to predefine these in Rhino, it would be much quicker than tracing them. So I'm just going to show you how to make a mask. First, I'm going to copy this texture and the mask together. I'm going to select them both, copy, paste in place, and now right-click, make clipping mask. And when I do, the texture is applied to the box. And you can play with this in many different ways. I'm going to illustrate one more way to play with it by making a live paint just above it. Copy my full object again, make sure I'm not copying anything I don't want to. Okay, I'm not. That's good. Paste it in my live paint. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put white there and I'm going to put black here. And I've covered this with a live paint that's using only white and black, but what I can do with this is set that opacity to, I don't know, 15. let's go to 30. And so now this object has a little more depth and texture at the same time. You could also play with under your transparency settings. If you open that under your window, you have normal, darken, multiply. Multiply is pretty good, but you can really play with how these things are interacting with each other. You could add color to this. You could offset them for a weird effect. There's a lot of things you can do with these textures, but I'd like to see, whereas the live paint is approaching it by face orientation, I think you can really approach object through this masking technique. And then anything else you want to do to this isometric drawing in terms of approaching this in a unique way or some way that describes your project or your brand, I think is fair game. You can even throw in hidden lines and see how potentially an object like this might interact if it's somewhat see-through. And I want to see if I can do that really quick. So my mask is on a separate layer, don't forget. And my texture is on. I'm going to copy this, per the usual. In my mask layer, I'm again going to draw. Make sure I'm drawing in color so I can see it. And unfortunately, you can only do one shape at a time in this rendition. Make sure this is sent back. And with this shape selected, make clipping mask. It's set behind, so let's change its opacity to 50%. 30%. And so now it's somewhat see-through here. Maybe 30% is too much. It's somewhere in between. You get the point. So now it has a slight transparency, and if we wanted to continue it over on this face, that would be a good way to do that as well. I think this is a really unique way to approach how these things are interacting and all of these different layers. I think the key thing to remember about this process is to keep your parent geometry and textures on their parent layers and copy them onto new layers as you use them, rather than spending them and needing to replace them. Oh, that's the other thing. I missed that part. You can go to File, Place, and then select any image you want, and it will place the image. So that's how you import a JPEG or potentially a PDF, is with the Place tool, or not really a tool, more of a procedure. Okay, so we have 3 halfway isometrics here, and when you're done, you'll have these 3 as well as 3 elevations done in 3 different techniques, such as these. I'm not saying to do it exactly as I've done it. I think you can approach these in any way you see fit, with any style that you see fit, with any material that you see fit. It doesn't even have to be, approaching it by block, potentially. It could be approaching it randomly or in some way, shape, or form. It could be a unique image. Maybe it's scenes from a favorite movie that you have that are ending up on faces of these shapes. Maybe this, develops into some sort of 3-dimensional projection. You can take it into Photoshop later and play with the color balance and copy and paste and things like that. I think there's a lot that you can do with this final iteration. There's even a lot you can do with this second iteration. So play around, have fun, and I think this is a good opportunity to really get to know Illustrator in depth. And then we'll see what you come up with on Tuesday. Okay, thanks you guys. Good luck.